All right. Hello, folks. We are live. And give me just a minute to check our audio settings. I see the chat room is having fun. And I got lawnmowers again right outside my window, so that's not cool. But hopefully they'll go away soon enough. All right. Lance, say something quick, please. Say a quick hello.
Testing 1, 2. Sally sells seashells by the seesaw.
All right, yeah, I hear you. I see you just fine. So we should be good to go. Sorry about the loud background that I have, but again, like I said, should be temporary. All right, so good morning, and welcome to Code It Live. Thank you for joining us. If you are anywhere, North America, South America, good morning. I see West Coast, Dan Siegel, our good friend. Dan, good to see you, buddy. You're West Coast, and it's way too early for you, but glad to have you with us. If you're anywhere else in the world, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you again for joining us here at Coded Live. As you all know, we are a bunch of developers who chat about different things that we are passionate about. Lots of .NET, lots of JavaScript, and we try having fun throughout the week. All right, so in the chat room, I have the tiger is here. Hey, good morning, and yeah, I see you are trying to listen in on us. If me and Lance say anything embarrassing, which I hope we didn't. All right, so with me, I have the fantastic Lance McCarthy. So please introduce yourself, Lance.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. As Sam said in that wonderful introduction, the fantastic. Thanks, Sam. My name is Lance McCarthy. I am a developer from Boston, still in Boston. I go everywhere else, and I seem to end up back here. My day job, I work with Progress Software, and I do technical support, covering all of our DevTools stuff. But in all my spare time, I still do the same thing. So it's kind of like, do what you love and you never feel like working. It's true. Um, I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Windows development. These days, the different Windows dev kind of categories blend together a lot. So I do a ton of Xamarin stuff. I do a ton of .NET stuff, even just JavaScript and plain HTML stuff. But for the most part, my heart belongs with .NET and Xamarin. Xamarin's kind of a leftover from my original love, Windows Phone. We all know what happened to that.
Yeah, we shall. Yeah,
But
well, I can talk all day about Windows Phone. I spent like 3 years of my life with Windows Phone. It was beautiful. It was just sad. Um, by the way, I am Sam Basu, developer advocate here at Progress Software, and you see us all the time. And I'm super happy to have Lance on board here with me because Lance is kind of hardcore. He does deal with a lot of real world things that we see from our customers, and he's just as hardcore a dev as you can get. So I'm delighted to have you here. Lance is a fellow like Zamel aficionado amongst us. So yeah, we have a long history of doing Windows Phone, UWP, all types of Zamel frameworks, WPF, and now Xamarin.Forms. And yeah, things will get interesting moving forward. I think Zamel is going to be in good hands, and we'll target more and more frameworks and other things. So before we start, though, Lance, I got to ask the all-important question. So what are you doing with your hair situation? With your
with the
hair,
what?
because mine's a mess. Because I haven't had a haircut yet.
See, this is where, like, I highly recommend doing training and other things you normally don't do. So I went to barber
Oh
school
man,
and I got my
nice,
license. Yeah, so I've been able to cut my own hair throughout this little isolation period.
nice. Good for you. Good
Yeah.
for you.
Like, yeah, I mean, this isn't just for barbering,
Yeah,
it's for anything. Like, if you find it highly interesting, go do a little training on it, and, it's a practical skill that you'll always use.
absolutely. Hey, chat room dancing is saying he hasn't even slept in this morning. Oh no, he did sleep in. Wow. I mean, it's 7 a.m. in the morning. That's like sleeping in. Well, good for you, Dan.
Right.
Good to see you, buddy. Thank you for joining us. All right, so after we're done with this little dance, so Lance, tell us what you had in mind. I hear dependency service. I mean, your brain goes to 1,000 places, but tell us what you had in mind.
So, I mean, when we first discussed about hopping on the stream, a million different ideas popped in my head, and I was trying to think of something that is both a little bit technically challenging, but something you might commonly use. Um, Xamarin.Forms has a wide breadth of things that are just amazing, but sometimes it doesn't have something that you need. And one way to use those things that the native platforms have is through a dependency service. And I thought, why not do a dependency service and show how it works? And if you ever do find yourself in a situation like, well, Android does this thing, but it's not in Xamarin.Forms yet, you can do it. It doesn't hold you back. And so today, what we'll do is we will screen grab. We'll scrape the screen with the native APIs that's available, for screen capture, and then take that and turn it into an encoded image, either PNG or JPEG. And then we'll return the byte array of that image back to Xamarin.Forms, and then you can do whatever you want with it.
Nice.
So all of that said, a common question for that is, how do I export my Zamel to an image? And that's essentially what we'll do today.
So let's stop here, pause here for just 1 second. And the tiger in the chat room is saying, here's not a problem if you just shave your head entirely. Yeah, I don't know how if I have the guts to carry that off yet. Yeah.
And Jan left a really good comment. DI containers are amazing, and soon I hope we have more support
what you're doing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. For context, chat room, Dan Siegel is another good friend of ours. Does a bunch of XAML and Xamarin.Forms, and he's one of the core maintainers of Prism library for MVVM with your WPF and UWP and Xamarin.Forms app. No, maybe not UWP. I misspoke. But Xamarin.Forms and WPF for sure. And they're him and Brian Lagunas are always up to wonderful things. So they are both streamers, fellow streamers. So go follow them. Go check out their streams. All right. So Lance, I get the idea what you're trying to do. So this is like trying to capture something while your app is running, not like just take a screenshot, right? Okay.
Yeah. So one example I thought was very useful is taking a screenshot of a barcode, because let's say an app generates a barcode and you want the image file of that. You can't just take the XAML of the barcode and use that as the user. They don't know. So you can build this into your app instead of making the user take a screenshot with a different button combination and then getting into their photo library and getting that out. So you can build this right into the app.
Me. And also, just before you start, just so you know, folks on the chat room, you can see both of us, but you're actually seeing Lance's desktop. He's driving.
Yeah. So Tatooine, we are on my desktop. And you'll see these little snippet text files. I have these up here to save us some pain watching me type out some complicated code. But when I do copy paste something from there into Visual Studio, we'll walk through it and talk about what it does. But first, just really quick, this picture here, I think does a good job of explaining what a dependent service does. So on the bottom, you have the native platform. So we have, iOS, Android, and UWP. And we need a way to get the class library in Xamarin.Forms to be able to know the difference between them. And one way we can do that is with an interface. So with an interface, you say, here's what the class should be shaped like. And then you create the concrete implementation of that interface in the native project. And that's what we'll do. If you're curious, it's a great course in the app fundamentals documentation, and it takes you through device orientation. So that's a pretty simple API on the native side of things. You can say, is it in landscape or is it in portrait? It's a great way to get introduced into dependency service. All right. So the very first thing I'm going to do is just create a final new Xamarin.Forms app. And the templates that are in Visual Studio 2019 are pretty good. So you just come in and you create a new project and you filter by mobile.
And while you're doing that, in the meantime, chat room, Dan Siegel is describing how professional developers write code. We search and we copy paste. Yeah.
Yep. Like you can sit there and bang your head against the keyboard all day and trying to figure out exactly what this API does, and if F12 doesn't work for you, how do you figure this out? You go talk to the people or read the post from the people who have spent hours bringing their heads off the keyboard, and it's sometimes just a one-liner that's in a Stack Overflow post. As a matter of fact, a lot of this implementation that for this project, I did some research into what the native platforms API in the documentation, but it doesn't tell you much. Most of the time, it looks like an API reference. So you're just looking at a list of methods and properties, and it doesn't say how to use it. So we just call this Twitch demo. And then when you click create, we'll get the project wizard from Microsoft. So this is the project wizard that lets you set up a Xamarin.Forms out. By default, UWP is not selected. That's by design. And we will go with a blank project template. And if you're not familiar with Xamarin.Forms yet, there will be 4 projects created here. There will be one class library, which is the .NET Standard 2.0 library, that'll have references to the Xamarin.Forms NuGet packages. And then there will be one other project for every platform that you chose. So if, in my case, I chose UWP, iOS, and Android.
See,
you will see
it's
all
4
3.
for you, but it's 3 for me because I'm on a Mac. I don't get the UWP option at all unless somebody goes into a Windows machine, pulls up the same project.
Another scenario you might see is someone, let's say if I put this on GitHub and you open it up on yours, you'll see the project head for UWP, but it won't be loaded. It'll say this is incompatible. You'll see a little icon. It's not an error icon, it's just like a warning icon. I think it's a yellow triangle.
So hold on for just 1 second. There's like a very small echo coming from your mic, and it's not you. It's let me see. I hear you just fine, and there is no bleed over. My microphone is off, so you should be just hearing Lance's for. No, you're fine. Your volume is fine.
Because
it's just like my microphone is picking up a little bit of what I'm hearing on the microphone. So Dan, I pulled back a little bit on my sound settings. Hopefully that helps a little bit. But let us know if it's bothering you. Okay.
It takes a couple seconds for the initial solution load, because if you take a look at the 4 different projects and expand them all, there's a lot of files. So this initial load takes a few seconds, but once it's done, a particular project will be bold. So if we see how twitchdemo.android is bold, that means it's a startup project. So if we were to come up here and start debugging, it's going to deploy to Android or iOS if it was bold. To switch them, you just right-click and say set as startup project. To keep things simple during our little dev testing, we'll use Android, but I do have iOS to deploy to when we're ready, and UWP read a local machine.
Simulator. Okay, so chat room Dan is saying, yeah, looks like the echo is almost gone. So thanks for that, Dan. And this begs like the classic question that we have been answering with Xamarin for years and years. Like, can you do iOS from a Windows machine? The answer is yes and no. You do need a Xcode to do the build, so you do need some form of a Mac, either on premises, on your network, or in the cloud. So what Mac are you using?
I have 2. So an older MacBook Pro from 2013 is more than sufficient. So you don't have to go and get the latest MacBook and spend a couple grand. You could get one for like $600-700, or you can even use a Mac Mini.
Totally headless. Like so I mean, all we need is the Xcode CLI tools to go do the build and come back with the app package. That's all we need.
And there's a great new feature that Visual Studio and the Xamarin team put together is Hot Restart, which lets you not even have a Mac at all, right? Do that inner dev loop, they call it, the inner dev loop between Visual Studio and the device, and we love it. You just basically plug your iPhone into a PC, and you can keep deploying to the phone. But when it does come time to building the package and publishing it, you do need a Mac for that final compilation.
Yep, that's exactly what Dan said. Yep. Is hot restart out or is it still in beta? Okay.
It's out now. It's still listed as a preview. So if you come into tools and go to options, and I think it's under Xamarin. I forget. Oh, it's under preview features on here. I think there it is. Yeah. So if you open up your options environment and preview features, you see enable Xamarin Hot Restart, and you can learn more about it, of course. And I recommend reading that before getting started to save yourself some headache. But this essentially lets you plug in your iPhone to PC and just build out what you need to build quickly. And when it comes time to deploy, or not deploy, but to publish, you would just use the Mac to. So in this case, you can see that I'm paired to a Mac. And just in case we need it, I do have a VNC window open if we needed to pop into the Mac to show you the stuff. Basically, you have Visual Studio for your Mac installed on the Macintosh. And then that's pretty much it, right? So you come in here, and as long as it's on the network, usually you'll see the host name. If you don't know the host name, you can just type in the actual IP address and it'll connect. You right click and do connect or disconnect. You can see the other Macs on my network, a couple of Raspberry Pis.
So do you, one quick question before you move on, do you actually like the iOS simulator on Windows? Yeah.
I love it. It's so fast. So what you can think of this is a window. It's like a mini virtual desktop, remote desktop. So if you actually had the simulator open on the Mac at the same time and you started doing this through it, you would see that on the Mac desktop, it's doing the same thing. So essentially, it's a little remote desktop window into the simulator.
It's streaming pretty much exactly what the iOS simulator is doing on a Mac. But the nice thing is, like, if you are on Windows, you don't have to like pivot and look at your Mac. It's just F5, and you can see it in Windows itself. In the chat room, Dan Siegel is adding that you can use Azure DevOps with a hosted Mac agent and never actually purchase a Mac. Yes, that's your cloud solution, so you actually don't have to buy a Mac. You can definitely go get the build from Azure. And I think, what was it, Visual Studio App Center, maybe that had a similar thing where you could do iOS builds in the cloud. Yeah, so.
Yep, so they're basically agents that run on a Mac. And the compilation, as long as you passed in your certificate to sign the app and you download that, you can publish it. But that's a great suggestion and a free way to do it if you don't have a Mac. Yep. App Center is great. They take out a lot of the heavy lifting that you would have to do for configuration in Azure DevOps. I personally prefer Azure DevOps because I can do lots of little tweaking, but I do have some builds that go in App Center. App Center has like great testing tools and device testing, so you can like test your app on a whole bunch of different devices before even rolling it out to your beta testers.
Dan's mentioning another point that the iOS simulator, since you're on a Windows machine, like you could be on a Surface type machine. I mean, most Windows machines have touch, so you can actually pinch and zoom and touch your app and play with it like your users will. So that's another added benefit, because I don't think Macs will, or I mean, there are other ways of doing touch. I think the iPad Pro is coming along fine. But I get very mad when people touch my Mac monitor or my Mac screen.
Hands off. Okay, so the very first thing we'll do here is we're going to install some NuGet packages. We need one for Android, and I'll explain why we need this one once we get to doing the dependency service. But at a high level, the code needs access to, right? So you have a screen in an Android, you can think of the different views, fragments as islands. So just because the code's written there, it doesn't necessarily have direct access to the root of the frame of the application. So you need little helpers sometimes that will give you access to that window, and then we can scrape the pixels off of that window. And that's what one of these packages will be. So typically, when you start with the Xamarin.Forms app, you can do manage packages for solution. If you're using Visual Studio from Mac, this might not be available for you unless you have the Pro one. So you have to go into each individual one and then install the packages. But here we can see, let's click Xamarin.Forms. And we can see on the right that each one of my projects is listed and with the specific version of Xamarin.Forms that's installed. I don't necessarily need to update it for this one, but depending on what version of Forms you want, you just come in and one checkbox and install. You just drop this down and pick latest version, and you can install them. In this case, I'm going to search for one of my NuGet packages. And what this is, it just has some helper code in it. We'll go through that.
While you're talking, I see Jonathan Reed in the chat room. Hey, Jonathan. If I'm reading that right, he's also one of our colleagues. He teaches us Sitefinity. He teaches me Sitefinity every Monday, so good to see you. And yeah, it looks like a lot of people have thoughts on this touchscreen thing with the Mac. I actually don't want my Mac to get a touchscreen. I see what Dan is saying, but I mean, there are iPads. There are other things you can touch. Just don't mess with my MacBook screen, man. Yeah.
So right now I switched to the Android project and I'm going to plug in current activity. So James, you all might know James from Microsoft. What this does, this lets me get access to the window of the application. And we only need to install this in the Android project because iOS and UWP's native APIs will already give me access to the window.
James, good old James, our friend James Montemagno.
So many times when you install like a helper library, the author will give you a nice little README text that will open. I think all of James's libraries do that. The best time to do this is now so you don't forget later. So what you want to do is you come in and you copy this initialization method. And almost all dependency services in these kind of libraries need to be initialized. It's going away with some newer dependency injection stuff, and depending on how the library is written, you don't have to do this. But here, let's just take care of this now. And what basically you do is you look for where Xamarin.Forms is initialized. In an Android project, it's initialized in main activity. In iOS, it's done in app delegate. See it right there, Xamarin.Forms in it. And in the UWP project, it's done in on launched. You become very familiar with where these are, but if you don't, it's always like in the documentation for the particular platform, or it's in the library, like the README text shows. So it basically says, hey, go into whatever your base class is that launches the application and put this in there. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to come over to main activity, look for where Xamarin.Forms is, and right after that, let's give ourselves a little room.
Hey Lance, two quick things. Could you bump up your font size just a teeny bit in Visual Studio? Please.
How's that?
Yeah, looks better, yes. And Dan is asking the same question that I had in mind. So we all know about Xamarin Essentials. I mean, so essentially the whole Xamarin components and the plugins thing was open source, and it was a mixture of the community driving it and Microsoft owning it. Xamarin Essentials essentially gives you like 30 or so APIs that does most of the things that we used to do. So this current activity thing, it does have a Xamarin Essentials component, does it not?
Yeah. I think so. Let's see. Activity. Which one did you say it's in?
Let's see.
Main thread, no. But when I first wrote this, Xamarin Essentials didn't have a current activity one yet. But if it does, I can definitely upgrade the code to only use Essentials. But all of these things you see on the screen now used to be separate plugins. Right? So you would have to know and look at different places to get it. And James wrote this to be a single one spot, very lightweight thing you can add instead of different, like a bunch of different packages. And if you look at the default project template from Microsoft, Xamarin Essentials is already installed when you do a file new. So right out of the gate, all of this stuff is available for you. I don't know off the top of my head the exact code from Xamarin Essentials
It's
that
fine. I mean,
replaces
you
this,
already
but
pulled
if
in
it's
the components, so you're fine. But Dan is saying it's in the essentials.platform thing, and I don't
yeah,
think it was just James.
there it
They
is.
had a full engineering team behind it, and they did a really nice job actually to kind of
Yeah.
grab most of the things we normally use from the components into a single NuGet directory. And they're also smart about tree shaking. So if you use Xamarin Essentials, and then if you just use like one thing, they don't bloat up your app package.
But he makes a good point. If it's in Xamarin Essentials, use that one. At the time I wrote this, it wasn't there yet, and I had to fall back on current activity. But it's the same thing. Current activity is the activity that's loaded into the screen, and we need access to that. And it's done through either Xamarin Essentials packages or this plugin, which is deprecated. This little error actually brings up a good point. Many times you might go to Stack Overflow or even from the README, and it used to be called bundle. But if you look at the code for main activity, it's called saved instance state. That might trip you up, but it's just this parameter. When the application gets launched, you pass it into current activity. All right, so we're done with the two main tasks to start off. One, we started a new project, and two, we added whatever package we need, whether it's Xamarin Essentials or current activity plugin. So let's close these windows, get them out of the way, and save this. So now that we think about the dependency service, we need to think about how we want to use it. So imagine that you're in the Xamarin.Forms project and you need to call a method to save the screen. So you're like, okay, so what do I want my interface to do? So basically we only need it to do one thing right now, capture the screen. And where you define an interface is in the Xamarin.Forms project. So I'm just going to add a new class. And I'll keep it the same name. What did I call it before? So what I'm looking at right now is I have a similar version of this on GitHub. Okay, so I called it iRenderService, which kind of, that's pretty straightforward. You can call it whatever you want to. And an iRenderService interface will have the methods. And let's do that.
So you're writing the interface in the shared directory, and then you will have implementers in each project. You're writing this in the shared repo, right? The .NET Standard repo. Okay.
Yeah. So this is actually a separate project as a class library versus a shared project. There is another way to do Xamarin.Forms projects where this isn't a class library. Instead, it's a shared project, which gets compiled with the other one.
What I meant was like the shared project. I meant the library. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, shared projects it can be a pain. If you can avoid doing it, just don't. Just go with the template, what it does.
Yeah. And there are pros and cons, but 99% of the time, I prefer the class library.
I know for a fact if you're doing Uno platform, which is taking UWP Zamel to iOS and other like WebAssembly, Uno actually very explicitly chooses to use shared project. I was having a long conversation with Jerome Laban, who's a fellow MVP, super smart guy, and they have some very, very good reasons as to why they're doing shared projects because of the builds and the things they're doing. But for Xamarin.Forms, I think class libraries make a lot of sense.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes a lot more sense for Uno. When you do, Visual Studio doesn't have a separate interface template, so you do a new class and you change class to interface. So at this point, we got to think about what methods we want to call, like what things do we want to implement on each platform. And so in this case, we wanted to return a task with a byte array in it. That byte array will be the pixels of the actual scraped image. So here's where we're going to hop into my first snippet. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see the whole thing. So we have a task that returns a byte array. So in the native platform code, the concrete implementation of this interface will have a method that runs some code in it, and it returns a task with type byte array. This here could just be a string, right? I could just say, hey, how do I want to render this? I gave the option to do PNG or JPEG. So the way that you would tell the native platform which one you want to use is you pass a parameter. And to make this easier and cause less mistakes, what I did was I just created an enum called render encoding options. So we can just create an enum here. And we do PNG and JPEG. And let's put this into a separate class so that it's nice and clean. So what I just did there was a little helper. All it did was it took this code out of this class and turned it into a separate file over here. So let's go back to the render service here. So there's another option that we will add, and I'll do that now so we won't have to come back to this class later. I also, by default, the way this works is it takes the entire screen. We don't want that all the time. We probably want to get a smaller size of the screen because we can't actually pass in Zamel to the native platform and say, hey, give me the pixels for this Zamel element, because the native platform doesn't know that it's Zamel. So in that case, I have a separate one which has a few extra parameters in it. So in addition to me asking for what kind of image encoding, I ask for a few different things. Where do we start the cropping? X and Y, and how big and tall do we want the cropping? So what it'll do is it start from one corner by a particular amount, and then go over one corner, and then create that rectangle, and that's what we'll actually capture from the screen. And that's what these parameters are. And I did one little particular thing here after a bunch of different experimentation, is that each platform's pixel density is different, scaling factors are different. Figuring out exactly the right numbers to pass into here can get really complicated. So to make it easier, I did it in a proportion way. So let's go over 10%, let's go down 10%, and let's take a screenshot that is 50% wide and 50% high. And I found this to be the most effective for a simple demo without overcomplicating the parts that's not directly related.
So does the user get to choose like how much of the screenshot he or she or they might want? Okay.
You can. So
yeah.
This is just code, right? So you could put some text boxes or entries into the app and say, how wide do you want it? Or you can do it with your own logic, which we'll do today. So you can have two buttons, one that says get the whole screen, and one that says get just this QR code. And then we do the math on where that QR code is. All right, so the fundamentals here is that we have an interface that requires two different methods be implemented. Good, where do we go from here? So at this time, we're done with the Xamarin.Forms project. So this class library, we're done with that for now. Now we need to look at the native platform. So in this case, it's Android. And what we want to do is we want to create the concrete implementation of this interface. So we can just call it render service. So let's add a new class. So if you notice, we are now inside of the Android project, right? So up here is the Xamarin.Forms class library. Let's collapse that to keep the noise down. And you can see that we're inside of Android. What do we do here? Well, we need to tell this class that it is an implementation of this interface. So what we do is you implement it. I render service. So what this does, it adds a using to, should add a using statement. It's in the base namespace. So you'll see an error all the time. And this is because the interface says, hey, you must have these two methods, and both those methods must return the task byte array. So an easy way to do this is use Roslyn and say implement interface. It will add it for you. And the next thing we do is make this a public class. Okay.
So for the chat room, Lance, you just casually dropped Roslyn. Tell us a little bit more about what exactly Roslyn is and what exactly you did.
So what just happened was I had this, let's uncomment this. So right now, the code says this object task, but the compiler is saying, I don't know what task is. Roslyn is a part of Visual Studio that analyzes the code and then provides helpers. You can have your own Roslyn analyzers, but out of the box, Visual Studio has some great ones. And you probably have gotten used to this little yellow light bulb. And it says, hey, there's something wrong with the code, and here are some potential fixes. The potential fixes are, hey, you should add a using statement for system.threading.tasks. And there we go, it fixed that. Same thing happened when I did not have the two required methods of the interface. So the analyzer, the static analyzer is saying, hey, you're saying you want to be an implementation of the iRender service, but you don't match what it requires. And if you hover over it, Roslyn will give you some information that says, hey, render service does not implement interface member this method. And because there are two things that we're missing, it gives you both error messages. A lot of times this will seem overwhelming, but if you do take a step back and just read what the error says and says, hey, it does not implement this member interface, like some more complicated language, you can just say, hey, it looks like it's missing this and you need to add it. What I did to add it automatically was a little helper from ReSharper, but Roslyn offers the same thing. So you can see implement interface. And what it'll do is it says, okay, we know we need this method, and it has a signature of one parameter, and this method with the signature with these other parameters. So now we satisfy the requirements of the iRender service. But at this point, if we try to call this, we'll get an exception. And the exception is not implemented exception, means you didn't add the code. Before we do this though, let's, just like we did with the plugin, want to make sure that we do what's necessary in the platform for dependency service. We'll go back to main activity. When we had the plugin or Xamarin Essentials, you need to initialize it in this case. So for the case of the render service, we need to initialize this too. So when the application starts up, it says, what are my dependencies? So we're going to say that dependency.
And while you're typing, you gotta love Dan Siegel in the chat room who's dropping knowledge. If you install libraries like XUnit, it'll give you analyzers that tell you more tips and tricks about what to do.
Yeah, and a lot of times you can see them in the actual references. This project doesn't have it, but you'll see another section underneath dependencies, and you can expand it and see the different analyzers that are available. One easy way to test this out is do a file new ASP.NET Core 3.0 project. And there are some Roslyn services that are available out of the box and installed for you. It makes coding so much faster. So Microsoft focused on closing that inner dev loop. You'll hear that term all the time, the inner dev loop. Because let's go 5 years in the past. Xamarin was difficult, more difficult than it's today, right? And how did the team sat down and said, how can we make this easier? What are the pain points? And they talked to a lot of developers and said, well, connecting to the Mac doesn't work great. Oh, I can't, see my changes. Or the designer isn't that great, which is one of the biggest points. So they came up with hot reload. In your XAML, you can just save the file, and in the emulator or simulator, the changes will be loaded automatically. So things that you take for granted in other platforms, like in UWP native or in WPF, you didn't have them in Xamarin.Forms. So a lot of those little things over the past 5 years have become a lot better. And specifically in Visual Studio 2019, it's light years ahead of what it was in 2014 and 2015.
Yeah,
And
that's a very good point. Like, I mean, a lot of us who are old, I mean, we remember the early days. Things were painful with Xamarin, but things have also come a long way, and the engineering teams and all the folks who want to work with the community to make things better really have. To your point, Lance, I mean, I think some of the things that Xamarin is constantly compared with are web technologies, and it's just a whole different ballgame. Like if you look at the JavaScript native side of the family, things like NativeScript, things like React Native, or even like Flutter. They're using things like Webpack, and I mean, it's just a whole different ball game for them to only update parts of the app that you need. For Xamarin, it's a little more heavy lifting, and thankfully, all of that has been worked out with Hot Reload and Hot Restart.
yeah, I mean, some very smart people came up with like we know what these other platforms are doing, know how they're doing it, but how do we do this with something that needs to be compiled as a native package? So they figured out ways to just go in and replace certain parts of that. And this only works under certain conditions, like you're compiling under debug, and you don't have certain compilation settings enabled. All right. So what did we just do here in the code? So just like we would need to do with some other things to initialize it, the same thing goes with the dependency service. We register it, and the way we register it is by saying the type. So dependency service dot register, and then we say the type. You might be familiar with this if you do a lot of dependency injection. You don't pass a particular instance of anything. You just say this is the type that is going to be needed. And the platform does a lot of the heavy lifting. So to take a step back, in Android, we implemented the interface into, we have a class that does this, and then we told Xamarin.Forms to register it. Now, from Xamarin.Forms code, we can actually use it. But right now, it'll just throw an error. So what are the things that we can do on the native platform to return a byte array that contains the pixels of the screen? So let me go back to my snippets and grab a couple out of there. And this is where the code is for that Dan was mentioning that is obsolete. So if you see me fixing these issues, it looks like I misspelled my enum. So you see this error here saying, hey, we don't know what JPEG is. That's because if we come back to my enum, I spelled it differently. So just call it JPEG. The joys of live coding. Like these are the things that you do all day. Right? Small things that aren't necessary.
Take us back one step to your, like what were you passing into the dependency service?
So when we register it, it's just a type.
Yeah,
is this what you're talking about?
Dan is saying it might take an instance eventually. There's a PR out.
Yeah. And Dan is an expert in DI. Right? Prism is a symphony of dependency injection, and it's beautiful. And like they're religious, right, Dan? It's a big deal.
I cannot say I understand all of the moving pieces, just the basics.
Right. Okay. Oops, I copied too much.
Maybe we should have Dan join us on a stream. Dan, open welcome here. Come and teach us DI one day.
Okay. Now that I fixed my little syntax problem, we can walk through what's happening. So on Android, they have some nice helper methods that will let you get a bitmap. And the bitmap static method, create bitmap, lets you pass in some parameters to get started. So the first thing we're doing is we get the screen, which is through this plugin. The plugin, I'll look up how Xamarin Essentials is doing it, and I'll update my repo with it. But essentially, it will return the same thing. It'll get the current activity, and then I can, from that current activity, I can get the view that the user is currently seeing. So essentially what this is just the screen, right? So I'm getting the view object, the window object of the screen. What that helps me with first is I'm creating a bitmap. It doesn't have any pixels in it yet, right? So we just say, hey, I want the bitmap to be this wide and this high, and I want it to have this kind of format, which is ARGB. Each platform has its own little quirks on what's the best format to use and what the native format is. On UWP, it's slightly different. iOS is slightly different. So the next thing we do is we get a new canvas, and then we take the root view and we take all those pixels and we draw it onto the canvas. So in memory right now, we have an object that has predefined width and height and particular pixel type. And we take that and we draw those pixels into this canvas object. The next step, let me make this a little cleaner, is we're taking those the information in the canvas and we're turning it into a memory stream by compressing. Sometimes the native platforms methods will give you different ways to get it out. This one didn't give me a byte array. I could return a stream, but to keep this demo simple, just keep it a byte array. Don't worry about having different tasks open and worrying about returning the tasks. So this is just a personal choice to keep the demo really simple. So what happens here is we're saying, what did we want to choose for the pictures formatting? And we pass this in the parameter. We say, hey, I want it to be PNG. So if it's PNG, our PNG here, or our JPEG, we say, all right, what's the native platform's settings to use that? And that's what this is here. We're compressing it with the PNG format or the JPEG format, depending on what was passed to the method. We write that into a stream. So the bitmap method takes the pictures, the pixels, puts it all into a stream with the selected format type. And the last thing I do is take the stream and turn it into a byte array. So all that said, we can collapse all of that. And what it comes down to is if I call this method, it'll return the entire screen as a particular image type in a byte array. The next one, proportions, is the same thing except with a little bit of math to change the bitmap area. So let's go back and look at that code. Okay, so the last method, which is simpler, just render async. This one is render relative async. And the reason why it's relative is because it's relative to the positions on the screen. So we're saying we want it to be this amount from the top to the right, this amount from the top to the bottom, and these dimensions. That's the only thing we added. This is just a little bit of math to determine exactly what that means. And then when we create the bitmap this time, we pass in those dimensions. So now it'll just grab that part of the screen without getting the whole thing and then cropping it afterwards. Same technique as before. We draw it into the canvas and then we encode it. And finally, we return that stream as a byte array.
Hang on, is this iOS or is this UWP?
This right now we're on Android. Yeah. The same things will be done on both other platforms. And this is the beauty of using the dependency service, is that the only thing the Xamarin.Forms project cares about is that these two methods. We have these two options to use. All of the details and math that goes on in here is bubbled away from Xamarin.Forms. You don't have to worry about that there. So it's just concerned about what the interface says is available.
Yeah, no, I had
Okay, so
like while you're moving on, and keep typing. I just had a side thought. Since you are actually able to control like exactly what part of the screen you want to take a screenshot, I'm thinking ahead. So maybe this is something that's doable with the kind of library you are building here. We at Telerik, we make Telerik UI for Xamarin, which is our Xamarin UI suite, and I'll drop a link here in the chat room so folks can follow along. So we have this thing called the image editor. This is particularly for images to kind of crop things, to kind of do different type of effects on it. But it uses like a very nice shadow effect. So it gives you that like cross thing and like the corners of the screen that you want to crop. So I wonder like if you could build something on top of your library to say, I want to screenshot just like this portion of the screen, and then let that UI drive the parameters that are coming into your methods, and then you just get that.
it's funny you say that. That's exactly what the
Okay.
demo does up here. In this, yeah, because we have PDF processing libraries, I added some features to this where it grabs the screen and then passes it to the image editor. Then you can add
Oh, nice.
filters and cropping and also other stuff like rotation,
Nice,
and then
nice,
save
nice.
it again.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. Alternatively, you can even export that as a PDF, which is other parts of the
Sure,
demo as
cool.
well. But it, that intuitiveness that you just had with the image editor makes it so much easier, right? You don't have to worry about the math for getting the relative parts of the screen and any of that. You can just say, okay, grab screenshot, and the next thing the user sees is actually the image
Right.
editor and all the tools. So it looks like it's built right into the app. So everything I'm talking about today, now that you can see this is on GitHub, I go into more depth about how it works. So if you're interested in actually using something like this in your
So when you get a second,
shots and
Lance, go ahead and post the link to your GitHub repo in the chat room. But again, you don't have to do it right now.
it's right there. The custom Xamarin demos has a lot of other apps in it. There's all like little edge cases, and I'll probably come back and talk about certain things like Xamarin.Forms effects. Xamarin.Form effect is similar to like a custom renderer where you can do things on the native platform and talk back and forth between the native platform and the Xamarin.Forms code. But at the bottom, I have a list of all the demos. Render image is just one of them. And the link to the right will bring you right to the code, and this will scroll you down in the README. And like you mentioned before, like who gets to decide what part of the screen gets cropped? There are some text boxes in there that you can type in the dimensions to play around with it. Oh, so sometimes you do lose connection to the Mac. We'll go back to that later. Okay. So what you see here in front of you, I'm now back in the Xamarin.Forms project. If you look over here on the right, we saved everything we did in the Android project. We created the class, we registered it in main activity. So now it's ready to be used. Before I go into the iOS and UWP implementations, we can do everything we need to do in the Xamarin.Forms project. So what I did is I came to main page, which is the entry page of the application, and I replaced the code with a grid. Zamel grid lets you define columns and rows and have different dimensions for those rows. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want the top row to fill the entire screen except for whatever space is needed in the bottom row. And what that really means is I'm going to put a button on the bottom, and we'll say render screen. We'll put that in that second row. Rows use index numbering, so the second row is actually index 1. What do I actually want to render? I thought barcode would be good, but it could be anything. So to do the barcode QR code, it's the same thing that Sam said about the image editor. It's inside those libraries. So I'll just come in and we'll add a new package for that. But it could be anything. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It's just Zamel, and you'll get the screen. So what you see me do here is I just switch to our NuGet server, which has the packages. And it'll search for the package that I want.
So while you're doing that, I had a side thought. So when we are building the visual tree with Zamel in a Xamarin.Forms application, I think it comes down to personal preferences sometimes. I think performance is the same. Do you always do a grid lens to kind of lay out your UI? Okay.
It depends. For example, if I'm using a control that uses UI virtualization, those kind of controls need to know the dimensions in order to know when to recycle cells. And for those, I'll put it inside of a grid with a row definition of star. If I put it inside of a stack layout, or if I put it inside of a row with the auto definition,
Yep.
it's infinity. So the height is infinity, and that breaks measurements. Other than those scenarios, I just pick and choose what's best for it. Generally speaking, grid for the root element is pretty good, but you have plenty of options in Xamarin.Forms. There's relative layout, there's absolute layout. Grid is just an easier way to visualize where I want to put different things on the screen, and it doesn't care what the final size of the app is. So let's say we deploy this on UWP. It's a window that can be resized at any time versus an aspect ratio on a phone like 16:9. On that, I want the big part to be able to expand and collapse according to the window size. This row definition will always do that. And I always want the button to be in that bottom area, but squeezed down to only the space that it needs. The auto height does that. You can accomplish, you can pretty much do all this with all the different kinds of layouts. Grid is just a quick.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to.
it.
Like, I mean, if other factors are taken out, like, what's your preference? For me, like stuff like this, like I almost always go to a stack layout, but I can see where the grid has some advantages, like especially
Matter of fact, stack layout
It
causes
can,
a lot of problems.
And you really have to know like how the fill and expand, the center and expand, all of those things, like how it takes up space as your screen changes.
Actually, the default page. So if we're going to add a new page to this project because we're going to navigate after we take the picture. You'll see that the new project template starts with the stack layout. And the stack layout is nice and simple. It squeezes everything it can. Forgetting about the other settings like fill and expand or center and expand. The default behavior is it wants to squeeze all the elements in it into a nice stack. Now, where does the stack layout go on the page? The default is to go to the top. So if you were just to do a stack layout here and I put the barcode there, it all gets squished to this top of the screen, which in this case, I don't want to happen because I want to know the middle of the big area to take the screenshot. The stack layout is good for when you want to put a bunch of things together inside other places. So what I would do, for example, if I wanted 2 buttons in this bottom row, IntelliSense is a little behind. You can tell when you get dependent on your IntelliSense autocomplete. So for this, now the stack layout is in the first row, right? At the bottom of the screen, but it's squeezed the 2 buttons together. This is the perfect scenario where I use stack layout a lot. There's a tool for all your scenarios, and sometimes you find out later that grid wasn't good for what you want to do and relative layout is better. The Xamarin documentation has some really good images on how these work. So you can just Google almost any of these, right? You Google it, but just make sure you're going to docs.microsoft.com or to somebody's blog post that's walking you through it. Like Dan has a bunch of blog posts, and there's a handful of people who talk about these different things in Xamarin.Forms. To start though, the documentation kind of shows you with colors to help give you a mental picture of how the different layout control works. And over here on the left, there's a main page for all the different types of layouts.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of all the things that we have seen improve as Xamarin devs, and Docs is definitely one of them. It's really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, flex layout, pretty cool. Right? That wasn't there
Right.
several years ago. Yeah. All right, so for in here, I actually already wrote up the barcode I want to use. Nope. Sorry, I gotta look off screen for a second. So I wanted to use a QR code. And everybody knows what a QR code is. So what I'm going to do is keep this right in the middle of the top row. If you don't define a grid row definition, the default is always 0. But depending on your code style rules, sometimes you do need to always define it, even if it is the default value. For clarity, we'll explicitly say, hey, this is in the first row. So right now we have a screen that has 2 rows, a button and a barcode. QR code I've set here, and we put it right in the middle. And the value can be anything. You can, say Twitch.
Hey, Lance, once you're done typing this, we got to do something important. Do you have a drink next to you? Water, coffee, anything? Chat room says we have been talking for too long, so we got to take a drink. Hydrate. Hydrate.
Right? Yeah.
That's our good friend Ivana Dimitrova in the chat room. Hey, Ivana.
You are more generous than a lot of the people I have to deal with on the phone. Okay. Let's collapse all. I'll select that so you can see where we are. This Xamarin.Forms project, the very first page that loads is this one. So why don't we just make sure things are where we expect them to be, and let's start it up.
Hey, chat room, Dan. I mean, this is some sort of a black liquid. We are all in quarantine, so who knows what it is. I'm not saying people are drinking more, but, whatever floats our boat.
Right. The first time you compile is usually longer than the rest. Just to make sure we're on debug. Release compilations take significantly longer depending on the platform. And you don't want to accidentally build under release,
All right, so I see you threw up a barcode and then a button. So essentially you're trying to grab the entire screenshot of the barcode and the button as well, and then you can crop it out, right?
Yep. Or we can use the other method in the platform that crops it out beforehand. But for the sake of simplicity, the concept and approach is the same for both, whether we crop it or not. The dependency services method is being used to run that code on the native platform and then give the results back to the Xamarin.Forms code.
Yep. Oh wow, it's already been like an hour, more than an hour that we've been on. So time flies.
Right. So it's a good thing we're only going to do iOS. Android.
Let's just do Android. Oh, and by the way, in the chat room, I see our good friend Salt and Burn M. Hey, good to see you, Chris.
Okay, so we are deploying to the Android emulator.
Drum roll. So this is like time for seeing stuff in action.
It didn't break.
Didn't break. Yay.
But the button doesn't do anything yet, and we'll do something about that right now. But it's pretty much where we want it to be. The barcode's right in the middle, and the button's on the bottom.
Perfect.
So let's add a click event handler for this. So here is the big part about using dependency services. So how do we tell this to use the code that we wrote in the native platform? And this is where the magic of the dependency service comes from. And I will show you. So first thing I need to do is make this async void. It's a button click, which is usually okay to say async void, but generally don't do this unless it's the top level event handler. And let's get rid of the try catch, which is some other stuff. What I just did is I got out my protected code. Don't do that in a production environment. This is what we're essentially going to boil down to. So you remember how in Android platform, we registered this service. We said, hey, dependency service register this particular type. In Xamarin.Forms, we get that back out by saying, get this render type. The main difference here is you notice that this is the interface and not the concrete implementation of the render service class. That's because that's the point of abstracting this away. We're saying, find the service that matches this interface type. And because we're running on Android, it's going to use that service class that we wrote. And let's see what it actually surfaces. Let's see the two methods that we implemented. The interface says, hey, I can guarantee you that render async and render relative async methods are there. So you can use it from here. And what we did is we say, hey, I want a JPEG, because that's the parameter that we set. And all that logic going through the screen, putting it into a canvas, compressing the bitmap and formatting it, and it gives you back a byte array. The byte array is an already encoded image type. So I can say, let's save it now, right?
Oh, you're getting into local folder stuff in Android. Let me turn on your chicken walking thing, because you're slowly inching towards scary territory sometimes, especially on Android.
Yeah. So thanks to .NET Standard 2.0, we can use system I/O, right? So we can say file.whatever. And thanks to the fact that .NET Standard 2.0 has those APIs in it, we can say, hey, use environment special folder in the local app data folder. You could put this in other places depending on the platform. But because this is a temporary file, I don't need to save it in any special folder like the user's pictures folder or something. So I'm just going to put it in local app data. So this is basically the local file. I'm going to call it JPEG. This would be a little safer. This is hard-coded in there. Typically, I would just take the choice that I chose here and append it. Matter of fact.
Chicken's gone, Lance, if it was giving you stress. While you're coding, Chris Soderburn, I don't know if you finally figured out to get beer delivered. I don't know, you were trying. Would be a nice service.
All right, so what we did was we changed the file extension to whatever one we chose. So what that'll do is it'll create a JPEG
That's
file.
nice. I mean, you're letting the user choose, yeah.
Yeah, so you would maybe have like a button or a checkbox or something that says use PNG or JPEG or something.
And you're using that as part of the file name. Yep.
To make us read this a little better, we'll keep it the original way. Okay, now that we have a file path, which is the combination of the folder and the file name. Now notice I use path.combine. This is important when you're having cross-platform code because different platforms use different slashes for their file paths. Doing this ensures that it'll be the right type of join. So you can rely on this being exactly where the file is. And next, I just check to see if we already saved something to it. You know, like the last time the user saved a temporary picture and we delete it if it's already there. And then we take all of the image bytes that are already encoded with this particular encoding choice and we save it. All of this code here I have in my helper library. So, oops. I can make this a lot simpler. So everything I just typed out is inside of here. So it's a little helper method that determines the platform, gets the right path for the local folder. All we need to do is give it a file name, and that's what we do here. So what do we do next? In the demo, we navigate to another page. So very quickly, I know we're running out of time, we're going to add a second page to go to. We could show it in the same page if you want, like hide and show different things. To make it a little more easier to see what's happening, I just created a second page. We'll call it result page. In results page, we are going to pass the file name. Because we know that's what's going to be used. So all I'm really doing here is typically depends on your structure. How do you want to get the data to the next page? In this case, I'm just passing a string of the file name of where it was saved to. So in the other page, we can put an image control. So remember earlier I mentioned that the default layout element when you do a file new is the stack layout.
So you're gonna read the same file out, essentially, and show it in an image.
So an image, exactly. And a good way to give the user the ability to pinch and zoom is just put it inside of a scroll view. A hacky way to do it. And the reason why I made the background darker is so that because the background of the app is white, we can see the edges between the image that was captured versus what the app is currently doing. So in here, we take file name of our folder of file image source.
Is VRA a new keyword?
Right?
Hey, no pressure, no freaking out. We got 15 minutes to go.
Right.
Try to see this thing going. Sorry, chat room. My sound today has been horrendous. First up, you heard. I didn't realize there would be lawnmowers and all of the crew outside my window today, and then I can hear my son getting up and ready for his lunch. So it's we're beyond the point of apologizing. Everybody is home and kids are home. It's fun.
So Xamarin.Forms image control lets you choose many different places to get an image. In this case, we know it's from a file, so we can do from file, and then we give it the file path. In real app, you probably wouldn't do this in the constructor. You would rather do it in the on appearing event so that it doesn't hang up the UI.
Yeah.
This is exactly right. You don't typically do this here.
That's fine. It's demo.
But now we need to navigate between the The only other thing we really need to do is make the root page a navigation page.
I don't know if Dan Siegel is still in the chat room. He's probably freaking out like, don't do navigation like that. It's just a simple last in, first out. You should never hardcode your pages inside of a view. That's all right. Just for demos, Dan. It's all right. We are not deploying this. Yeah, so for context, like if you're new to Xamarin.Forms, Xamarin.Forms does have some bits of MVVM, which is a design pattern built in. So things like data binding, a navigation pattern, which is very basic, and then like a messaging system. And demos are way different. Yes, Dan. What Lance is using is just like going from page 1 to page 2 and just explicitly hopping over, which is okay for this. But if you are building a really big app that you want testability, you don't want those hard references in your code behind file. So that's where you use a navigation service. Maybe you bring in a framework that does MVVM from the ground up, so you don't have to do some of this heavy lifting. And yes, Prism is wonderful, and Dan maintains it. But again, I mean, think about like how much you're bringing on and what you're trying to do, and balance things out.
Yeah. So normally you would have like this source bound to something in your view model. So binding, result, image type of thing. And the view model would handle the navigation because Prism will handle the dependency services for it'll do dependency injection for whatever that view model has. There are tons of great demos too. They have a huge library of different scenarios that you can quickly go to for reference. In this case, I mean, we have an hour. It's hard coding the code behind. In my real apps, there's no button click event handlers. They're commands. The only thing you might see back here is this binding context
We're just
equals my
messing
view
with you,
model.
Lance. You're good. I do this all the time.
No, you're absolutely right though. We don't want people building huge apps with a bunch of
No,
code
I mean,
behind.
for what it's worth, like the memory leaks when you had button click event handlers, like those things are kind of done, I think, in .NET, but it's just not very readable code. It's just not structured right if you do this.
Yeah, and usually you find out too late,
Yeah.
right? So you spent months building something, and then you realize that you implemented navigational wrong,
Yeah.
or MVVM is
Yeah.
wrong. All
Okay,
right,
I see an
so
Android
we're finished.
emulator.
Yep. So this is main
Yep.
page, right? So we started up the app. In the button click handler, we're saying get the image, right? So we're going to render async. This is going to invoke the code that's inside the dependency service class that was in the Android project. Gives us back an image byte. We save it to local folder, and then we go to the next page with the name of the file. So let's see what happens when I click it.
Go. Fingers crossed. Yeah, I see it. I see stuff. Good.
And that's the whole screen. It's a scroll viewer, so I could pinch and zoom and kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
it's really nice that you put the dark background so you can see which one is the image versus which one is the screenshot. Yeah.
That was one of those discoveries you find out the hard way. It's like I really can't tell.
Yeah. And then, I mean, now that you have an image, you can throw this to an image editor, and you can pinch and zoom, and you can crop, and you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
so
pretty sweet.
In that fact, if you have a chance, I put the link in the chat today.
Yep.
But you can come in, run this, clone it, run it. You'll see that what we do is we navigate from main page. You take the picture, and then we go to the image editor page, and then you can do whatever you want with the image editor page, and then that goes to the results page. And then if you decide to export it as a PDF after the fact, you can do that, and then it goes to a PDF viewer page.
Nice.
But the fundamentals are, what makes all of this work is that we created this dependency service class that does the logic on Android to get the pixels from the screen.
Yeah. And I'm sure like iOS and UWP will have different nuances, but I mean, the idea is just implement that for each platform and let the dependency service handle as much as you can.
Exactly. So it's like, put native API code here to do,
Right. Hey, I'm going to take a quick second to answer something that the chat room is asking. TBD Gamer, hey, good to see you. That's a very relevant question that's been asked. Like, if you are coming back to Xamarin, or if you're just new to it, how do you know that you're doing the right thing? And I'll let Lance chime in, but here are my thoughts. And I say this with some reservation because I want to be realistic. So MVVM is a design pattern. It's got nothing to do with any specific framework, and there are frameworks that really help you out to do the right thing, the right design and structure for your app. But like, don't kill yourself over it. I've actually seen like people go to like a one-day hackathon and they get all confused because I mean, you're bringing in some structure to your app, but you're breaking up things into smaller pieces. A big proponent of what I see some people do is it's called like pain-driven development. So start with the basics and bring in stuff when it's causing you pain. So if you see yourself in a project which is getting harder and harder to maintain sanity over, or if you have like a bigger team that you're working with and you want testability, you want some structure, yeah, absolutely. Then you bring in stuff and you slowly refactor. And if you understand the basics, by all means, go and do MVVM. But just so you know, you don't have to. I mean, things have steadied quite a bit. But if you understand what you're doing, by all means, go for it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, also, before you start writing any code, invest in a little bit of time just reading up on other projects. So you can see how project A did something and how project B did something, and then you can make a just choice on which is better for you. That one day of reading or that one weekend of reading saves you a bunch of headache down the line.
Exactly, exactly. All right, so this was pretty cool, Lance. You kind of started from the absolute file new project from scratch, and you wrote a dependency service. You took a screenshot and you brought it in as a stream. You wrote it out as a file, and you go into the platform-specific things, and then you read it back out as an image. Does that capture everything that you did? Yeah.
Yep, but the main takeaway is all of the image stuff isn't specific, right? You can put whatever you want inside that dependency service. If you need native API A and B, go ahead and write one for A and B, and you can now use it in your
Cool,
Xamarin.Forms.
cool. Yeah, I mean, Lance and me were just chatting real quick yesterday about stuff we wanted to build, and yet things take time because we are writing things from scratch. So, Lance, I want to thank you. I think this is a good logical place for us to maybe stop for today. We want to be conscious of people's times, but I really like the other thing you wanted to talk about, and I think we should probably devote a whole hour to it, and that's effects, and that's custom renders, and when do you do what. So I think that's a very intriguing topic. I know very little about those things, so I'm very excited to learn. So, Lance, if you have time, I'm sure the chat room. Do you want Lance back on? Because I definitely do. If you have the time, I would love to come and or have you come over and teach me more things.
Absolutely, I'm happy to hop on and go through different things. We can ask folks, do a poll, what they would see the most or what they find the most difficult. We could always do those
Absolutely.
topics too.
And while I have you folks in the chat room, Salt and Burnham, we should get you back. We should get you to come and join us sometime. Talk about maybe accessibility from a mobile developer standpoint, because like Thursdays we are devoting to mobile dev, in particular Xamarin. So I would love to know like your take on that. Yeah, let's do it. And Dan Siegel is in the chat room. He said he might come and join us and teach us some DI. So much to learn
Yes,
from each other.
I would love to see some DI and demystify some of because it looks
It does.
scary at first, and then you realize
Yes,
it's
yes, yes.
not.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
So, folks in the chat room, you can find Lance on Twitter. You can find Lance in that GitHub repo that he posted. nburns21c. DI is dependency injection, or I don't know if I can come up with like funny acronyms for DI. It's like do it yourself until you don't understand. So yeah, so thank you, folks, for never heard of DI. I mean, we are old. I don't know if you can tell. Like we're a bunch of old dudes here. We have been developing for a while, so we have our shortcut names. Yeah, I do React and Node SQL, and I mean, so the funny thing, Lance, to me is how the web side of the things have rediscovered some of the issues that we have known from desktop for years and years now, like dependency injection, like the staggered layering of things, pre-rendering things, data binding, all of those things. You see exactly the same concepts in Angular, React, and other things, right? So if you have your concepts in a good place, you can switch around. It's the same things that we do in many different platforms now.
yeah. It's usually just a case of learning the specific syntax of the other platform, but the fundamentals are the same because it's a natural evolution of computer science for a particular thing. Like you don't want too tightly coupled, because it has its limitations. And how do you get past that limitation? Oh, dependency injection or MVVM, or there seems to be a natural evolution for a particular platform once it
Yeah.
gets more mature. And
Absolutely. Hey, it looks like Burns is actually a UI API architect in out of Boston, so that's where Lance is from too. So lots to learn, yeah. And again, if you're doing React, we actually do stuff on Wednesdays where TJ, one of my colleagues, he teaches us React and all the different things about React. So yeah, come and join us whenever your time permits. And Lance, any parting thoughts?
No, just do it and have fun. If you get frustrated, I'm always available. Send me a tweet. My DMs are open. If I don't know the answer, I'm not afraid to say I don't know, and I'll find someone who does have the answer. We're a tight community, and we
Yep,
leverage that.
exactly. Well said. All right, folks. I appreciate each and every one of you. So lots of love for all of you. Thank you so much for joining our stream. I will try to get Lance back on and schedule him for an upcoming week so he can teach us more about Xamarin and NFX, and then we'll get all of the folks that we talked about in the chat room up with us as well. So with that, that's it from us for now. Yeah, later, kids. Stay safe, stay productive, and yeah, have fun doing what you're doing. All right. Bye
Bye,
bye.
everybody.
Thanks.